Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming this evening to this amazing, I'm so excited to hear this, because I haven't heard this. I know the title. I do not know the talk. Sometimes I actually know the talk. This is all going to be new to me, too. I'm Melody Birkins. I'm the director of the Institute of Arctic Studies in the John Sloan Dickey Center for International Understanding. And I am so excited. First, let me introduce to you Professor Gordon Hickey, who is the William Dawson Scholar in the Department of Natural Resource Sciences at McGill University and specializes in sustainable natural resource management, policy, and governance. He is the head of the Sustainable Futures Research Laboratory and director of the McGill United Nations Environment Program Collaborating Center on Environmental Assessment. And he and Alyssa Noseworthy, who are here, are going to talk to you about a project that I think goes much further back. But this is part of something that the Institute of Arctic Studies tries to connect our U.S.-Canada relationships, and I'll tell you a little bit more of how that started with Professor Hickey. But it's sort of a long-standing Dartmouth-McGill dialogue on Arctic issues, but we do that through a U.S.-Canada internship that we have every year. It's had started actually in the remote times, and we're now moving it, transitioning it into more in-person, and they're just up the road. And we found a wonderful partner in McGill and with Professor Hickey and his Sustainable Futures Research Lab. But let me mention what he does up there. He pursues a diversity of high-impact research with one strand focusing on how we achieve more sustainable development through monitoring and assessment of natural resources. He also studies the resilience of natural resource-dependent communities, including indigenous communities of the Arctic. He studies food resource and agriculture policy, and he thinks about the relationship between knowledge and decision-making. And I know many of us here at Dartmouth are also thinking about that. How do you move knowledge to decision-making for sustainable development? How do we collaborate? How do we co-learn? How do we share knowledge for the innovation that supports a more sustainable and inclusive future? So he studies that at Sustainable Futures Research Lab. Prior to joining McGill, he was the manager of forest policy and projects at the Department of Sustainability and Environment at the State Government of Victoria, Australia. You might hear an accent. You might hear that. He's presently an associate editor of the journals Food Security and Society and Natural Resources. He completed his bachelor's at the University of Melbourne in Forest Science, a Ph.D. at the University of British Columbia, and a Master's of Public Administration at the Australian and New Zealand School of Government at Monash University. I first met Gordon when he was our 2019 Fulbright Canada Research Chair in Arctic Studies here at Dartmouth. While he was here, the former Institute of Arctic Studies director, my very good colleague, who's maybe watching this online at some point, and I recognized quickly that he was here not only to develop his own scholarship and his academic connections, but he was also talked to us often about re-energizing what I just mentioned, this strong partnership between the US and Canada, between Dartmouth and McGill around Northern Studies. And that included this, he knew more, I think more than we did, of a Dartmouth-McGill Arctic seminar back in the 1960s that the Institute of Arctic Studies, or then the Northern Studies program, had been part of. So after that visit of him as a Canadian Fulbright, he invited us up, myself and some postdocs and graduate students. We went up to join McGill's Northern Research Day. That happened to be in January of 2020. We were making so many plans for next steps. You may remember what happened. And so fast forward through the next times of remoteness, again, we said, you know what, we're going to keep doing this. We actually had students remotely work with Professor Hickey and his colleagues, and now as we continue to have that, and you'll hear in just a moment, we had 2 students work with him this summer, and that gives me the opportunity to introduce Alyssa Noseworthy, 24, who was one of our US-Canada interns selected to work with Professor Hickey and his postdoc, Dr. Antonio Sons, this summer in partnership with another 24, Piedra Gos. All their names are up here. Alyssa comes to us from Wisconsin and is majoring in Romance Studies, French and Spanish, with a minor in Translation Studies. So good? Oh, good. When she applied to the internship, she let us know she had spent her summers with her family in Newfoundland, Canada, and was always drawn to issues of ocean conservation and biodiversity, and had done research on issues of fishing and sustainability. And as a major in humanities at Dartmouth, she told us she was really excited to bring that knowledge, her humanities knowledge and perspective, to this Arctic research in sustainability and sustainable development with Professor Hickey and Dr. Sohn. So the 4 of them Dr. Hickey, Dr. Sung, and our 2 students work together, again, largely remotely, but now we get a chance to be together and I think you're still working together to advance the work we'll hear about this evening, Tales of River and Ice, Indigenous Art, Resilience, and Water Justice in the Arctic and Amazon. And my hope is that if we made it through a pandemic, we have a history of working together and we have a really wonderful future of working together between Dartmouth and McGill. So thank you very much for being here, and I invite you both to the podium, and I'll turn this off as I've been told. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Well, thank you for a very nice and thorough introduction. Thank you for the invitation to be here today and for making the time to join us. So, Alyssa and I are presenting on behalf of our collaborators that are listed here, and were just introduced by Melody. And beyond that, there's a further acknowledgement to make, which is that the study that we're going to talk about today is really a small part or a subset of a larger project being led by the University of Greenwich and funded by the United Kingdom Research and Innovation Arts and Humanities Research Council. And this project is being led by Dr. Pamela Katic and has a number of collaborators which are listed here, some of which are our local partners in the settings that we're exploring the issues we're going to talk about today. And there is a US partner, Dickinson College as well, which is in Pennsylvania, which I'll mention a little later, who are working on this broader project, which I'll introduce shortly. We're going to begin with a short background. You actually got a bit of extra background on the partnership. I'll just give a little bit more information on our internships and what we've been doing to this point. And then I'll summarize the larger project that I've just mentioned. And then we'll get into the more specific and interesting part, which is where Alyssa describes the work she's been doing and some of the issues arising and questions that we might want to continue thinking about and maybe have a discussion about at the end if you have additional reflections or insights to share. So yeah, the background, well, that was just laid out pretty nicely, so I don't think I'll repeat that. But I will say that it's been a very enjoyable experience working with the Dartmouth interns. And here's a summary of how we framed the internship. So I'm essentially an applied social scientist, actually an interdisciplinary scientist, but I draw on socio-ecological research methods predominantly. And the way we frame this is an opportunity for students to come and look at Arctic science issues, learn social science research methods, learn data handling, processing, and perhaps even if they're interested, participating in analysis and publication of results. And this is a sort of a shared undertaking that we commit to when we start. So, as Melody mentioned, we started in 2020, and from 2020 to 2022, we hosted 5 remote interns, and alongside those Dartmouth interns, we also had 2 McGill interns that worked with us on an Arctic science systematic literature review. It's a pretty significant undertaking, actually. We looked at all the science that had been published in Nunavut and in Greenland on any topic related to science, whether it's health or social or natural sciences, and coded and categorized these data, these papers, these manuscripts, according to the various variables that we're interested in. So what's the disciplinary focus, who's the lead organization, community partner, different questions we had about the research. And that database is now complete, and it's being analyzed, and we're hoping that we'll have a paper written, sort of a McGill-Dartmouth co-authored piece for sort of a policy audience, probably early in the new year when that comes. And then this year we made a little bit of a change because we realized we don't have to be solely remote anymore, and the idea was that we could actually come together a little bit more in person. And we had this new project that presented an opportunity to sort of start exploring through a systematized review some of the connections between Indigenous peoples, water, justice, well-being and health and resilience. And we were lucky enough to have Alyssa and Piedra join us. And also there is an intern at Dickinson that's been working on similar questions, following a very similar method, but focused more centrally on the Amazon. So today we are presenting on our findings on both the Amazon and the Arctic settings, but our focus was more on the Arctic. And so we're yet to sort of combine the data sets. And so I also want to sort of acknowledge or state that the work being presented today is still in progress. We're really still finding out exactly what we learnt. So I mentioned I'm an interdisciplinary scientist or interdisciplinary researcher, and perhaps I've been a bit safe, but as a scientist I've tended to stay away from arts and humanities. It's not a space, I mean, of course I enjoy arts and all the beautiful things that go on in that space, but I don't and haven't used them in my research before. So this is sort of a new frontier for me, and I just thought to get us into the spirit, I put up 2 paintings that I found online that the artist had depicted interdisciplinarity from different perspectives, and I think the ideas around how art can help us to cross boundaries and engage in dialogues across culture and generations is something that I definitely want to continue to explore going forward. So the current project, as I said, this is the larger project. It's a 2 to 3 year project, and it's being led by the University of Greenwich, is really interested in not just understanding some of the connections between art and water justice and the resilience of Indigenous peoples, but also trial and co-develop some art-based projects and engage in some conversations, intercultural dialogues around water justice, water sovereignty, and water governance. So water governance is sort of the big concept, perhaps, and within this there are some let's say, sub-concepts that are very important. Perhaps the most important of all is this idea of water security. This is the ability to have access to the sufficient water for good health through means that are culturally acceptable and that are not financially burdensome. Water sovereignty introduces a little bit of politics into it. It's not just an objective, you've got enough water the way you like it and that you can afford. It's actually who controls the means of producing the water, conserving it, moving it, processing it, delivering it, and planning around that. And in fact, when we talk about water sovereignty, it's an idea of bringing the control of that process and it closer to the communities, or in fact giving it entirely to the communities. And then water justice, which is a major concern, particularly amongst Indigenous peoples globally. And these are based on principles of fairness, equity, and addressing marginalisation and ensuring human rights are respected. And so Indigenous peoples have been increasingly, and for quite a long time, voicing that they are suffering from water injustice, that they seek to have water sovereignty, and through water sovereignty, they seek to manage and govern and be stewards of water through their traditional knowledge and life ways that allow them to maintain the sort of relationships with water and with each other that they wish to sort of practice. Now, just to bring in another angle, another layer on top of the water justice is the connection between injustice and mental health and well-being of Indigenous peoples. And in fact, research well, maybe I should start by saying something perhaps you all already know, that rates of suicide in many Indigenous communities in Canada, in the US, globally, considerably higher than the national averages. And as you can see in this diagram from Alaska, very high rates of suicide amongst youth. And it's complex, of course, but research has found there is a connection between water insecurity and suicide risk, and that water insecurity is an environmental dimension that it leads to increased suicide risk. On top of the ideas of some of the issues that you could imagine water insecurity might bring into your household, into your life, which I'll further elaborate on in a minute, there's also what's going on around the household. Environmental change, climate change, water's changing, relationships with water are changing, that maybe the ice is no longer there, maybe the river's not flowing the way it used to, maybe rain's not falling in the ways and in the patterns that are known and understood. There's also environmental changes occurring to the quality of water. There's pollution, there's diversion, and all of these things are affecting and changing the landscapes around which many communities base their life and livelihoods. And of course, we have beyond the changes that are being experienced in a very rapid and real way, and the household water insecurities that are being experienced, there are also the sort of, let's say, past and ongoing and present processes of essentially systematic cultural genocide that has gone on against Indigenous peoples that has led them to continue to sort of suffer from trauma and need to process trauma in many different ways and sort of ensure their resilience in the face of adversity. And while Indigenous peoples are resilient and have been and continue to be remarkably resilient, there are many concerns, and of course, not least of which would be that trends in mental health amongst youth are worsening. And so this leads us to some questions that we need to tackle, because of course we have lots of science and resources that we direct at these issues. So in Arctic Alaska, water insecurity is a major issue and in many rural areas, and in fact, many households, predominantly Indigenous households, without any running water, and they need to haul water or sanitation, and sort of life involves going to a central water point and hauling water in barrels and buckets that you use in your household. Of course, this requires fairly extreme water conservation and makes life quite difficult. And even houses that do have running water often experience water insecurity through frozen pipes, boil water advisories, the water's not safe to drink, the water's not safe to bathe in, etc. That can happen when infrastructure fails or other things occur that are that due to the climate and the conditions around. And the really important sort of consideration in this is that, and it's considered a really major public health issue in Alaska, is that this extreme water conservation and the uncertainty that comes with that, and not having enough water to drink and to live your life without considerable, let's say, drudgery. It's leading, and it's been associated with a lot of different health issues: mental, digestive, skin, respiratory, etc. And what we find is that similar issues also in the Amazonia. And so, again, many Indigenous peoples don't even have access to drinkable water, and that's partly due to toxicity and pollution that's occurring associated with natural resource extraction. Also, land use changes, creating boundaries between people and waterways that were not previously there. We see that a small proportion of people get their water, Indigenous peoples get their water through sort of public networks. And we can see with this example of the number of oil spills in just the Peruvian Amazon over a sort of 19-year period, that water quality is something that is causing great stress and trauma to many communities that have long lived and have special relationships with the rivers and waterways, and also depend on them to live. So I know we're moving pretty quickly because we want to get to the interesting stuff that Alyssa's been doing. Why art? Well, art is something that has been found to be able to be quite powerful and useful in dealing with trauma. Art-based approaches allow people to both kind of process trauma and also communicate it, to communicate injustices or emotional issues, but also define ways forward and paths through trauma and traumatic experiences, and perhaps even envision different futures. And it's also a wonderful medium for intercultural communication and intergenerational communication. And in our work, we're really interested in whether art-based approaches, or the extent to which we can sort of design, co-design art-based sort of intervention or approach that could help us to facilitate these kinds of dialogues across boundaries, particularly like ontological, disciplinary, cultural boundaries. We're really interested in where that might lead us from a water justice and water governance perspective. The bigger project, as I mentioned, this is just, in a sense, we're just trying to work out what has already been done. That's what we're going to present today a little bit on. Our aim is to actually work with the community to co-produce some tools within this kind of framework that I've just described. We want to also engage youth in these processes, try and use art-based mediums to, I guess, enable conversations that may not be happening or might already be happening, but not across certain groups, and ultimately bring these art projects and art-based products that emerge through the process into a dialogue between Indigenous and non-Indigenous actors and people involved in water governance to discuss and consider water sovereignty and water justice issues going forward, and the extent to which, from a research perspective, these art-based tools may have broader application as we try to address these issues in the future. Our approach adopts a two-eyed seeing, I guess, philosophy. There are other terms for this. This one is commonly used in Canada, and I think is getting more widespread sort of adoption. But it's this idea of how can we be pluralistic, knowledge pluralism, as we look at these systems and these different environments that we're trying to understand and address issues in. And so we look through one eye with Western-based knowledge and the other eye through traditional knowledge and life ways and understandings, and through kind of this idea of walking together, and terms like weaving knowledge or braiding knowledge to sort of bring about outcomes that are both advancing justice and also sort of culturally appropriate and are likely to have the kind of impacts that we wish to see. And just one final point is, when I say art and art-based processes, we can think of it as both sort of the traditional art medium that we like, carving or painting or weaving, but there's also the more contemporary art such as hip-hop, street art, breakdancing, many different things that go on in Indigenous communities amongst the youth as forms of expression and solidarity and resilience in the face of injustice. And so we recognize that as we start, that there are so many different ways that humans express themselves and their experiences in these sorts of settings. So the purpose before we begin our journey with the community was to do a literature review that sort of captured, well, what's been done? What's already been trialled in relation to art and water and mental health and well-being and youth, and Alyssa's going to walk us through how we went about that and what she has so far been able to pull out of that exercise.
So, working as a Dartmouth McGill intern this past summer, I collaborated with the other intern, Piedra, to conduct a systematized literature review. And our research question, as described by Gordon, was to explore how art and art approaches have been used in Indigenous communities and by them in the Arctic and Amazon with a relationship to mental well-being and water justice. To show you exactly how we went about that process, we started with over 200 papers, which were found across two databases, Scopus and Web of Science, using search terms curated by Antonia and Gordon. And then we went through a screening in which we ultimately decided that about 25 papers from that over 200 were viable. I think that's a really important point to illustrate just how iterative this process is, that ultimately 10% of what we found was what was pertinent to our research question. Beyond that, we also conducted what we call a gray literature search. And in this, we are interested in finding papers pertinent to our research question that were not located by the two databases. We ended up going with 8 for a total of 33. And attached here is a flow chart which kind of shows how this process worked. So with the gray literature, you can see one technique that we use is called snowballing, where you look at not only search terms, but the references and bibliographies of already accepted papers and see if from there you can code new ones. We had to also remove duplicate papers flagged by both databases when we moved on to the screening. And then we did a title and abstract screening with 235 papers. In this, we're looking at titles, but also abstracts, 1 to 2 paragraph blurbs of what this essay is going to be about in order to determine if it was related. From that, we excluded 190 and then assessed 45 for full text eligibility. But even then, even when we screened the abstract and the title, you can discover that in the larger context of the paper, it is not what you thought it was. And from there, we excluded a further 12 to get to that number of 33. During that process, we had to actually redefine the parameters of our lit review a lot, because we had to think, okay, our location is the Arctic and the Amazon, but what does that mean? Lots of Indigenous communities, either through their normal lifeways of semi-nomadic migration or the colonial legacy of displacement and resettlement, are no longer exactly where they originally were. Not only that, but we, especially in the Amazon research, had to consider the effect of reserve zones. Then we also had to ask, what is art? As Gordon discussed, art can be framed in many ways, traditionally thought of as theater, performing arts, visual arts, but there are lots of different interesting practices such as basket weaving, drumming, clothing making, and even subsistence activities such as fishing, net and harpoon craft, reindeer herding, and cuisine, which were really important to consider as artistic practices within the scope of our review. And then we also had to ask, what is well-being? And to kind of illustrate that point, I've put up 5 different terms that are used by some Amazonian indigenous communities to show that it's not always what we conceive of from a Western science perspective. So we have the concept to live peacefully, living morally together, and from the Waorani, the collective happiness. We had to realize that well-being had to be considered not only from an individual perspective, but from the perspective of the larger community. In some ways, the individual could not fully thrive if they were already experiencing a larger communal threat. We also have terms such as the beautiful life, which I wanted to highlight because in specifically some Amazonian languages, the concept of beautiful and good are knitted together, and there is not a difference between the two. And then we have living well. I think all of these concepts were really important for us to understand what well-being actually meant in an Indigenous context, where the words used and the terminology that we know is not exactly the same. So here are some preliminary findings from our literature review that I would like to show related to art as a means of advancing water justice. This is a piece of artwork entitled Climate Change by an Inuit artist. And what I want to show here is this kind of juxtaposition of breaking up sea ice and the elder's face. Often when we consider water justice, we're thinking of drinking water and accessibility, but actually in the Arctic, changing sea ice has just as much of an impact on nutritional well-being and other forms of mental health. And so I've included excerpts from an interview conducted with this artist that I would also like to read aloud. As he says, "The ice is forming a lot later, and it is not as thick as it used to be. In the spring, when the ice starts to thaw, there will be open areas in some places where it doesn't freeze up at all. So that is some of the risk with global warming. It is very hard because we need to catch country foods for our families and friends. We must be able to deal with the changes that are around us." I want to flag that country foods is the term often used for food captured through traditional subsistence hunting in the Arctic. And the difficulty with the breaking up of sea ice is not only the disruption of hunting, but also a complete change to nutritional well-being. Store-bought foods are often being shipped to remote rural areas which don't have the same access and ease of transportation. As a result, the prices are expensive, the freshness and quality are not as good, and it is a completely different cuisine, often with our preservatives and other ingredients which are foreign to these communities. And that way, country food is deemed to be much healthier for these communities, but the access has been cut off through melting sea ice. However, there is a message of resilience and strength that I also want to highlight through this interview. As he says, we must be able to deal with changes that are around us. And he elaborates that this drawing communicates that the elders notice that the ice breaks up much earlier and does not form as it used to in the past. The elder is facing upwards. It means no worries. Keep your head up high. If I made the face look downward, that would mean that the end is near, but you were always told to keep your head up. So this artist made the very intentional choice to communicate hope and resilience through the upwards looking face. He decided that even while he was communicating about the problems of this community and the dangers of climate change, that it was important to impart a message of optimism. So that was an example of how visual artwork can start communicating these messages. But one other finding of the literature review that was really important was also potential solutions through sustainability. And for this, I've included an excerpt of a story that tells a bit of a warning. It's an Alaskan story about a young boy, the salmon boy, who disrespects a salmon that his parents serve him by refusing to eat it. He is warned not to do this, but being a young boy, he decides to ignore this advice. So he is punished by being transformed into a salmon, and he learns the ways of the salmon tribe. Already in this story, the concept of the salmon tribe is really interesting and important because fish are not seen as a resource to be managed, but actually as a different people who have a covenant with the fishermen. And so after he's learned these ways for a while, he's eventually caught by a fisherman, and his parents recognize that he is wearing the same copper necklace that their missing son used to wear. So they bring the salmon to a shaman to turn him back into a boy. Once he becomes a boy, he later imparts the knowledge that he gained back to his people and becomes a shaman himself. And this has actually recently been turned into a gorgeously illustrated children's book, as you can see on the image to the right, which is used to communicate to children around ages 3 to 5. So what can we learn from this story? One is the role of humans in protecting and governing water resources. And there's also the need to respect natural ecosystems and only take what is needed. The boy is punished for being wasteful. However, there's also the power of early sustainable education for our youth. You can imagine that the story being told with the main character as a young boy was largely intended for a young audience to teach them from an early age not to disrespect salmon, how to manage this watershed. And so in some ways, I think that this turn towards using children's storybooks as a medium has been a really important development to further spread these kinds of messages and to also communicate to the youth. The issue of fishery management is not only evident in Alaska, it's also actually a global Arctic issue, which I want to illustrate through the issue of salmon management in Finnish Sami, and those are the indigenous people in the Finnish Arctic. This is a first-person narrative of someone speaking about a sacred site within Sami. He says, "I recall near the home where I was born, there was a place where my father and uncles and elders and other people as well were forbidden to go. There was a lovely, steep, sandy-banked shore in the river to run. They didn't allow us to even walk there at all. I always wondered back then, well, why can't we? But now I have learned what was there. It was a kind of flowery still water. There was a lot of blooming vegetation, a really good place for salmon to spawn. And now, tourists trod and walk about right in the middle of this unique salmon hole, and all over its shore, and they fish in it. It needs to be protected for our fathers, for my father's brothers, for my mother's brothers, for my ancestors and my father's ancestors. It was a sacred place." And so in these instances, we can see how what is sacred is actually then encoded by traditional ecological knowledge. In this case, what is sacred and forbidden is a place where salmon spawn so that they can continue their natural cycles. I think that the point about tourism is really important to take because in this modern economy, we have really leaned towards ecotourism, and especially Arctic ecotourism, but we have to also consider the effects and impacts of it. This is, for example, a really non-sustainable form of ecotourism, as they are disturbing the salmon spawning hole. I think the call for protection, the appeal that this has been intergenerationally a sacred space is also really important to note. And that kind of leads me with this appeal to what we have been terming artivism, this kind of union of art and activism. Essentially, when art has a role in advocacy and for legal recognition. So this story is a first-person literary narrative that's been crafted by a team to give a voice to a river in the Arctic and also one in Australia. This kind of interconnected river narrative talks about the ways that rivers have been damaged. It gives rivers personhood, and it actually brings into conversation the impact of hydroelectric dams. And so I've included 2 quotes from this interesting river narrative that kind of shows how artivism can work in a space to promote certain changes to governance. They have discussed, argued, and negotiated, but have never listened to my voice. They eventually came to the conclusion that they needed to harness Unam and Shipu. So the hydropower pioneers of the 21st century came to excavate, backfill, divert, flood. They subjected the Kin River to the laws of the market economy, yet river will remain river. And then, how does one reconcile the clash between the free spirit of the fall and the twisted spirits of the dams? The murderous wound to the river has slowed me down, making me feel lonelier still. Have I not reached the threshold of a despoiled earth? I think that there is something very powerful about the rhetorical questions, especially asked by the second quote, because even in this protest, there is inherently the question of reconciliation. How do we reconcile the need for hydroelectric dams with the need to also govern water sustainably? It doesn't necessarily offer answers, but I think inherently it asks this very important question. And to bring this into a larger conversation about hydroelectric damming, I would also like to talk about the Jingu Park in Brazil and part of our Amazonian study. So the Jingu Park was essentially a reserve zone created in the 1960s to address increasing incursion in the indigenous Amazonian regions. And in many ways, it has aggregated lots of different indigenous tribes that had normally not lived together into one space, but at the time, it was deemed the best solution to the larger issue of incursion and extractivism. However, some of the trade-offs of creating this protected area is that while the land itself was under reserve zone, some of the headwaters around the area were not preserved, and now are often the subject of hydroelectric damming. There is this kind of narration used by the Lausha people called Aunaki, which is a kind of narrative technique of storytelling on site. And what came out of essentially a damming protest was the opportunity for them to narrate the story to some of the cultural anthropologists sent to the region. In it, they told the story of the grandfather of their people, claiming that this is his house, he's the one who made it. And by showing him this area, they tried to create a claim that this area is protected and should also belong to their cultural heritage. Their efforts to gain legal recognition, I believe, were ultimately unsuccessful, but it remains a really important part of how artivism is working in the modern day to show how understanding could maybe perhaps eventually be reached. And then a final example of artivism that I would like to show is actually once more in the Finnish Arctic, and it's the Diatnu River movement. Essentially, due to increasing legislations restricting subsistence fishing in the Diatnu River region, Sami people decided to declare a moratorium on their own river. And one of the artivism efforts that emerged from that was attaching lines from this poem that they made in 8 different locations along the river. As it reads, "Let the river be our bridge, clean water, the sacred song." A large part of the main protest was actually against what they have termed green colonialism, in which a policy is introduced seemingly to help protect the environment, but in fact continues a colonial legacy. And this moratorium ended in 2017, I believe, but it still remained a powerful source of protest against increasing restrictions on subsistence fishing. So as we continue this literature review, we are still left with some questions that we would like to continue considering and eventually answer. We are interested in how art is a way of treating water issues as to avoid treating water issues as technical problems that can be solved, and more fully engage with Indigenous-led water justice movements. We also want to ask, can art help to promote intergenerational healing, and what is the contribution of these practices to long-term changes in cognition, emotion, and behavior to deliver water justice? And finally, can the respectful weaving of Indigenous and non-Indigenous ways of knowing through art facilitate intergenerational and intercultural dialogues on water governance to support truth-telling and reconciliation? We're still very much in the process of finding answers to these questions, but I think they're important to guide us as we go along.
Great, thanks, Alyssa. So just to summarize where we're at, we're really not quite done the review. We're still collating all of the data, and we still also have the work done at Dickinson to engage with and contrast and compare. Our aim is to produce a report in the form of a paper, I suspect, that we aim to co-author and publish in the months ahead. And this will form sort of essentially a scoping assessment of how these different concepts might connect and what some of the opportunities might be. Then it's written here as photo voice because that's the way we are thinking it might go, but it doesn't have to be a photo voice type art exercise. So we'll go to the communities, we'll start to engage and listen to what they think might be helpful and useful in the context that we're interested in understanding how art could help us with these intergenerational dialogues, youth well-being and mental health, and also water justice. And so we'll go into that and begin those conversations. Then once the art project has essentially, the exercise has completed, we'll hold workshops, chance to exchange and have dialogue around water governance in an intercultural and let's say pluralistic environment around issues of water and water management and decision making, and then report back on how that went and what we thought may be potentially useful or have potential value in taking forward and scaling into other kinds of environments. That's just the sort of more Arctic-oriented work. The bigger project will do something very similar, almost the same, I think, in the Peruvian Amazon. And then the bigger project will, I think there'll be some traveling art exhibition to sort of ensure that the artists get to spread their work around and get feedback and get conversations going. And also I think there's an intention to bring the Peruvian Indigenous artists and the Alaskan Indigenous artists together to also have an exchange and talk about their lived experiences and the various challenges they're facing, and also the futures that they're envisioning for themselves in this sort of concept of water sovereignty and water justice. So that's our project, and hope it's given you some reflection. It's certainly where we're at. I think we're reflecting and thinking at this point. So thank you for your attention, and we would welcome if you have your own experiences working with art as a boundary spanning kind of medium, or if you've had have opinions or suggestions for our work or experience that you wish to share, we'd love to hear it. Otherwise, we'll answer any questions you have. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have time for questions, and we have a microphone that will come to you.
Thank you so much for the amazing presentation. So first of all, I was really inspired by how art is so powerful to, touch people's hearts, and also it's a way to, help with knowledge co-production as well. So I was wondering, what are some necessary steps to elevate art to inform decision-making, like at a government level, and what are some steps to take, and what do you see would be some challenges in achieving this?
That's a great question. I can start, but I think maybe, Alyssa, you have something to add to that, I think. Okay, sure. So, I mean, I think where we're at now in the sort of international water governance space is that Indigenous peoples need to become and need to be given sort of sovereignty over their water because of their very disproportionate and high rates of water insecurity and the injustices and linked injustices that they're living and experiencing. And so I think governments have already, and it's not just starting now, begun these dialogues with communities. The challenge is always how do you braid or handle these sort of ontological boundaries between Western ways of thinking, engineering, management, policy. There's a sort of a logic to it. There's a very strong logic to science, Western science, and it informs a lot of the way we would approach any problem. And so how can we retain that kind of thinking while also listening to a very different way of thinking? And so I think the dialogues that go on are almost like dialogues of the deaf in a sense. So they're talking to each other, but they can't actually hear what each other are saying. And so the idea here is that art might be sort of one of these vehicles for sort of enabling knowledge and communicating knowledge. Like you said, it sort of hits your heart a little bit. You can conceive of things in a different way through art than if someone just is talking about their issues. So I think it has high potential. I think the governments will want, with time, to see ways that we can enhance knowledge co-production and knowledge weaving and advance justice. But right now I don't think it's necessarily like a tool that's commonly used. So we want to understand that and see if it could be.
Yeah, I think to add to that some ways that art has been showcased in a way to make it more visible to other people and to give it a larger platform include museum exhibitions. I can think of the Hood at Dartmouth does a wonderful job, I think, at elevating and showing Indigenous art. The Rooms in Newfoundland is also an excellent institution that does that. I think beyond that one ongoing challenge with art that we're facing is that it is how people care, it's how people connect, but convincing other institutions of its usefulness in water management has been a historical boundary.
I mean, in some ways, if you are a scientist, there's an element of art in everything we do, isn't there? So I think that it is an area where we have some overlap, cultural overlap. Yeah.
Hi, thanks for your presentation. So I would just be curious to hear more about this concept of art as you're approaching it. So I am an archaeologist and anthropologist and work in the Southwest, where a lot of things that might be called art in one context might be a ceremonial object in another context, or as you were showing, just a basket, right? Mm-hmm. And this, how are you thinking about the concept of what constitutes art and your interlocutors? Are they, I could see something very performative, and then I could see something we're putting on a play, we are writing a poem, and then there could be something much more like, is it art to undertake some kind of a ceremony or a practice of relating to the river that nobody sees? So I was curious, and as you're approaching it, not necessarily how do you define art, but what are the boundaries there?
Yeah, what's in and what's out? That's a great question, and I don't have I guess I don't have a black and white answer for that, but I would say that we're relying on the local communities to define that for us, what the exercise that they think will help with the sort of the element of healing or dealing with trauma that they have identified as important, but also that we can also bring others into that conversation as well. So one idea that has been floated, and I'm not sure if it's going to happen, but from the local partner in Alaska is some sort of canoe journey. And there's a lot attached to that because there has been a lot of trauma in the communities there around youth suicide and other issues, and the idea of traveling the river and going through various ceremonies. So I think, I'm not saying that will happen, or maybe it will happen independent of our project, but these are the kinds of things. So yeah, it's a very good question, and I don't know, but I think we're going to let the community decide what that is.
Yeah, I would also add that I think we have opted for a very expansive definition of art in the hope that we don't exclude anything that actually is, in fact, artistic practice. One of the more interesting things I found through the literature review that I did not actually include for the limits of this very brief presentation is a tradition of sewing together fish skins, clothing production, making outfits for dolls. There's so many different ways that art can be expressed and hold still a very powerful aesthetic value. And so I think that we're also interested in like the purpose of art. That might be closer to our leading question about what is or isn't art. We're interested in therapeutic and healing approaches that can be achieved through art.
First, here, and then you already have the mic.
Yeah.
First, then behind.
Thank you so much for your presentation. My name is Valara, and I'm Arctic Innovation Fellow at the Institute of Arctic Studies. I'm coming from Malta Republic, and this is a indigenous nation, and from my native language, it means one people. And water, of course, is one of the greatest gift which we have, and for us, water is where we came from, and it's really it's sacred, right? It's not just art or just water. And I have my own story with water protection movement, because I came to the United States in 2016, and for me, it was so romantic. Like at this time, it was no double protests in North Dakota, and I thought like, hey, it's so like, excited that people stay for their rights. And then I went there, and for now it's still the most heartbreaking trip in my life, because I saw how Indigenous rights and Indigenous peoples were abused. But after that, I think there were a lot of activism, and I just wanted to add that for many reasons, this activism is the only way how you can stand for your rights and not to be persecuted, not to be silenced, right? So that is a way of protecting rights and kind of saying something, because a lot of women being prosecuted in the United States for water protection, and the legislature is getting worse in terms of what you can do. You cannot block roads now, you cannot do like a lot of things, right? Because now it's domestic terrorism is under domestic terrorism law. So, and that is just also a part how Indigenous peoples use arts in terms of the bringing this message and not to be terrorists. That's what I wanted to add. How we see it and how we use this art to set agenda and maybe bring more allies to a movement, bring more awareness, and again, it's kind of maybe safe way to help and stand, because not everyone can go to camps and spend a lot of months, but a lot of Indigenous young people do digital arts, and if you follow water protectors on Instagram, you can find a lot of amazing young people posting that. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. This is very interesting, and I think what I'm going to suggest is maybe farther down the line, but is there some way you could work with schools and educators and art teachers to bring this subject to younger people in the school systems who are perhaps learning to use their artistic skills? And this might be a wonderful way to get them to continue their Indigenous art forms. Mm-hmm. And I know this seems like this project is in its very earliest stages, but you did mention working with governments, and I was thinking, I don't know anything about this situation in the Amazon, but I'm sure that in Alaska and the Canadian Arctic, they do have school systems, and that might be an option down the line.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think it's already a lot going on. In general, I think in schools and around art and I guess dealing with and communicating and expressing emotions and things like that. So I think it's something. I don't know how much is done around water specifically, but I think schools are a place where some of that happens. And I think government's one group. I think when we're dealing with water sovereignty, there's a number of different actors that have to kind of find their place in that new arrangement, and the schools might be a really important place to be involved in that conversation. Yeah.
Yeah. One thing that I have already seen in the literature review is several articles that have published kind of the collective efforts of whiteboard video animation. That has been a really large outlet for trying to kind of harness social media and this kind of new digital medium to actually communicate and also create something artistic and train Indigenous youth in the process to like express themselves through art. So I think that's been one avenue that we've seen.
Well, I can't say thank you enough. If other folks have questions, we can come up, but I just want to thank you all for being here. And Alyssa, you're not a grad student yet? Well, I think we might have a little out of line. Thank you, Gordon.
Thank you.
And thank you, Alyssa. It's just been a wonderful experience. As I said, I didn't know what it was, and I'm so excited to hear this. And it's early stages, and we know now we have to come back. I'd really love to hear what happens, what works with communities. And please, if anyone has any more questions, please come up. But thank you for being here, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you. So with the work going forward and the workshops, we may have more internship opportunities. So hopefully that will continue. Yeah. So thank you for coming.
Yeah.
She